Greetings friends and acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. To say that a Jedi is not meant for war is to repeat a talking point that has been stated ad nauseum. The Clone Wars were the biggest proof of the Jedi Order's shortcomings, and were one of the first times in history where the fall of the Order had been entirely their fault. The dogmatic views of the Council had stifled their evolution, and the Jedi were stuck in the past, causing them to be completely blind to the machinations of darkness unfolding right before them. However, arrogance and shortcomings aside, there was a very basic thing that the Jedi missed when the Clone Wars broke out. They did not belong. Many Jedi felt this way, and many of them refused to take up the Jedi General title, but it would actually be one of the most prominent Jedi serving on the front lines who would state exactly why it was wrong for the Jedi to have joined the war, and that was the prestigious General Obi-Wan Kenobi. So today, my friends, we are going to review what the Master said concerning Jedi and the art of war, and then we ourselves will take our own look at the Jedi's place and where it should be in times of galactic war. But before we get started, we'd like to thank today's sponsor, Sterling Pacific Luggage. As Ahsoka prepares to venture out of the Star Wars galaxy as we know it, she'll need some sturdy baggage to accompany her. Sterling Pacific's state-of-the-art aluminum cases have been perfected to suit pilots and frequent flyers just like Hera and Ahsoka, and have been fitted with 50-52 aluminum, A30 aluminum corners, and impact-bearing ridges for optimal security and stability. Rather than using the normal cheap plastic parts with an aluminum base, Sterling Pacific prides themselves on their use of high-quality metals in all of their components, including the trolley handle and the wheel housing. Pair this with the state-of-the-art Italian leather handles and two oversized wheels for maximum control, and you have a suitcase capable of traveling through hyperspace. These cases are not only well made, but feel incredibly professional to carry, and are certain to protect the luggage of any intergalactic traveler. If you use our specialized code STUPENDOUS, you'll receive $300 off your order, so be sure to check out Sterling Pacific today. All jokes aside, this is a premium quality suitcase, and if you want to protect your luggage as you travel from across the world or even just across town, Sterling Pacific is a great choice, especially if you've seen those videos of people throwing luggage around. Anyway guys, thank you so much for staying tuned for the sponsor as it helps support the channel, and now let's get into the topic today. The quote from Obi-Wan comes from the canon Obi-Wan Kenobi comic. Here, we would find an older Old Ben Kenobi in exile, documenting his thoughts in the midst of a sandstorm. Obi-Wan was recalling the story of an especially traumatizing battle taking place on a separatist world. Here, he was sent to destroy the factory that was constructing a massive ion cannon that was to be used on the Malevolence. When speaking of the Clone Wars, Ben Kenobi had this to say: "As Jedi, we learned to fight from an early age, and I had already seen my fair share of combat. But this was different. All war, in part at least, concerns dominion. As servants of the Force, we learn that it presides over all like an unseen current. To seek any kind of dominance is to misunderstand the very nature of the Force itself." This kind of quote sounds like it would come from the lips of Qui-Gon himself, which just goes to show the kind of growth that Obi-Wan had after spending time reflecting on the war. He first mentions and acknowledges that as a Jedi, it is part of their duty to fight. A lot of Jedi make the mistake of being too passive and completely denying a Jedi's combative role in keepers of the peace. As I'm sure you're aware, this is a very misinformed take on the duties of a Jedi Knight. They carry lightsabers for a reason, and while diplomacy is always the preferred option, there are many cases where conflict must be resolved with a physical altercation. Obi-Wan has no issue denying this as a fact. Although he was literally nicknamed the Negotiator, he never hesitated when the time arose to act. He knew his role as a marshal and exercised it well, even in his exile. We saw this happen many times while he was among the public in the Clone Wars, and of course later in Mos Eisley when he took the arm of Dr. Whitesand. But peacekeepers though they may be, as Obi-Wan says, war was an entirely different thing. When you're marshalling a dispute or even fighting for justice, those are issues that can be resolved quickly, and also stay within the parameters of the Jedi Code. Jedi Knights, along with Masters and their Padawans going to various planets to settle matters of terrorism or political disputes, are the subject of many typical missions for a Jedi Guardian. But all-out war puts the Jedi in a precarious position, especially when it came to the Clone Wars. Here, the Jedi were forced to choose a side and align themselves exclusively with the Republic, turning a blind eye to the plight of the separatist worlds that actually needed justice. Not to mention, war requires guile, cunning, and as Obi-Wan said, dominion in order to win the war. All of these things spit in the face of the Jedi way and more importantly, the way of the Force. It could be said that the Force itself despised the Clone War, at least as the Jedi perceive it. The Force is indeed a flowing current that presides over all things. The Force works through the means of death just as it does life. Qui-Gon understood this and allowed himself to be a savior or an executioner, but followed what the Force dictated him to be. However, when fighting a war like the Clone Wars, the Jedi weren't concerned with the will of the Force, but rather the will of the Republic and the political interest. This means mass death, both innocent and Jedi alike, that were never a part of the will of the Force. Domination done by the Jedi throws them out of balance and the balance of the Force, and completely perverts the ideals that the Jedi were built upon. By doing this, they are not acting as servants to the Force, but using the Force to be servants of the Republic. When looking at it this way, it is an abomination and puts the Jedi in line with the Sith on how they wield the Force. It's no wonder the dark side veil was so easily blinding to the Jedi, since they had abandoned the ways of the Force itself. It's because of this that we see most problems with the Jedi Order stemming from times of war. In almost every case, anytime the Jedi have gotten far too warrior-like, it results in terrible consequences. This usually comes in the form of a bunch of Jedi turning to the dark side, or cutting moral corners and destroying their ideals. But this does bring up an interesting question. Sometimes war is completely unavoidable, and there are huge factions that threaten the peace of the galaxy. In those times, a Jedi must go to war in order to uphold their duty. So when exactly is the right time for a Jedi to fight in a war? I think the first thing we can go ahead and say is that it is the Jedi's duty to fight against the Sith. The Sith morally, ethically, and philosophically oppose the ways of peace and justice in every category. They are all about domination, and if they were allowed to flourish, then the dark side itself would become too powerful, and balance would be disrupted. While it's not ideal for every Sith to be destroyed, as that also tips the balance, the Sith cannot be left unchecked. Their ways of ambition and conquest simply cannot be quelled. If they were more like dark acolytes, content to study the ways of the dark side without threatening the safety of the innocent lives, then the conversation would be different. Much like how the Jedi approached the Night Sisters. Perhaps in that case, the Jedi might be able to let them live and thrive as they please, thus maintaining balance. But the Sith cannot be content to live that way, and thus the Jedi must fight against them. A Sith's calling asks for more. Another case of when the Jedi should go to war is excellently exemplified in the Mandalorian Wars. It was here that ironically, the Jedi made the wrong decision by not fighting until it was far too late. As the story goes, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders returned to the galaxy under the banner of Mandalore the Ultimate. They began acting and conquering defenseless worlds in the Outer Rim in order to draw out the Republic to fight. The warrior culture was spreading death everywhere, committing mass genocide. Yet, the Jedi Order, who had just come off the heels from the war against Exar Kun, were understandably very slow to join another war effort. But what is not understandable is the Jedi Order turning a blind eye to atrocities, proof that the Mandalorians were massacring entire people groups. Surely these actions caused a disturbance in the Force, and that is when one man, Revan, took up arms against the Council's permission and pursued the Mandalorians. It was in this case that Revan was in the right and went to war for a legitimately, so much so that the Force supported him in his power. Although Revan did end up cutting moral corners and doing some very un-Jedi-like things during the war, I think that if the Jedi had been all in and were allowed to back him up, he wouldn't have needed to take such drastic measures. The Mandalorians were threatening the peace and safety of innocent lives, and they refused to be stopped until they met a proper challenger. In this case, the Jedi going to war was not only justified, but necessary. The major difference with the Clone Wars, of course, and it was made very clear that the Separatists is all they wanted was secession from the Republic. This was exclusively a political dispute. It was something to be solved in the Senate courthouses, and if war was something that was bound to happen, it was not the Jedi's place to partake. The Republic should have formed their own military instead of looking to the Jedi Knights to fix the problem. By the Jedi going to war with the Confederacy, they cemented themselves as the sword of the Republic, and the sword of the Senate, not of the galaxy. The High Council justified this by saying that all they wanted to do was to end the war, and allying with the Republic was the best option for that. but they were just lying. I think that it would have been much different if it was much more like this. The Republic and the Separatists are having a big political dispute in the Senate and become enraged and commit terrorist acts against the Republic. This would be the Jedi's duty to stop them from doing so. That would mean keeping the peace. Or perhaps the Jedi were dispatched to keep Separatists from conquering worlds that wish to stay with the Republic. That would be maintaining justice. But denying aid to worlds in need that were not a part of the Republic like they did, and the atrocities committed on Mandalore and Sereno, and going to war on behalf of the Republic against a political enemy is not the way of the Force and is not the way of a true Jedi. This is one of the darkest eras of the entire Jedi Order, and calls into question if they are really true Jedi if they are partaking in such a terrible war. Individuals such as Luke Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano would go on to remedy this, bringing back the era of the true Jedi Knights. But anyway, my friends, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on old Ben Kenobi coming to this realization and saying that the Jedi should not have participated in the Clone War and that it changed what they were meant to be? Thanks again to our sponsor, Sterling Pacific, and you can check them out in the link in the description down below. But as always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting our archives today, and may the Force be with you.